right now going on.
The ambitious overseas agenda on the heels of a bombshell week at home.
The entire thing has been a witch hunt.
New revelations around that stunning Oval Office meeting. Trump reportedly sharing classified intel with the Russians, calling James Comey a nutjob. We talked to the man who was in that room.
Is that what the president said?
Our exclusive interview with National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. Plus,
there is no collusion.
A special counsel appointed to oversee the Russia investigation. Now, what's Congress's next move? Tough questions ahead for the chair and ranking member of the House Oversight Committee. Plus, one of Trump's staunchest critics during the campaign, Republican Senator Ben Sasse. As the president takes the world stage, can he outrun the chaos here at home? From ABC News, it's This Week. Here now, Chief Anchor George Stephanopoulos.
Good morning. As we come on the air this week, President Trump in Saudi Arabia about to give a major speech to the Muslim world. Billed as a message of hope and tolerance, it's likely to signal a major break from the harsh rhetoric of the president's campaign, when Trump railed against radical Islamic terrorists and said flatly, Islam hates us. The White House also hopes that this whole trip will bring a welcome break from the most battering week of the Trump presidency, a daily cascade of damaging headlines. Monday, the Washington Post reports that the president revealed highly classified information about ISIS to the Russians in the Oval Office, compromising a key source and complicating our intelligence relationship with Israel. Tuesday, the New York Times reports that Trump privately tried to get FBI Director James Comey to drop his investigation into former National Security Advisor General Flynn. I hope you can let this go, he said, according to Comey's memo. Wednesday, the president was blindsided by his own Justice Department. Of course, that was the appointment by Attorney General Rod Rosenstein of a special counsel to investigate Russian interference in this campaign. And this drew a sharp response from the president on Thursday, who called this a witch hunt. And of course, Friday, there were those two bombshells from the Washington Post and the New York Times tag team. The Washington Post reporting less than 2 hours after the president took off from Saudi Arabia that a senior White House official has been identified as a person of interest in the Russian investigation, reaching closer than ever to the Oval Office. And the Times revealing more about that extraordinary Oval Office meeting with the Russians. Now, remember, the timing of that meeting was less than 24 hours after the president fired FBI Director James Comey, who was leading the investigation into Russia in the 2016 campaign. In his first face-to-face meeting with Russian officials, Foreign Minister Lavrov, Ambassador Kislyak, the president told them, I just fired the head of the FBI. He was crazy, a real nut job. I face great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off. There are so many questions swirling now about that meeting, the timing, what exactly was said and why, how will the Russians use what they learned, and of course all that is fodder now for the special counsel and Congress. And one of the few people in that meeting, National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster, he's our exclusive guest this morning from Saudi Arabia with the president. General McMaster, thanks for joining us today. I want to get to the trip, but first some questions about that meeting you all had with the Russian foreign minister. New York Times, as you know, reporting that here's what the president said in the meeting. I just fired the head of the FBI. He was crazy, a real nut job. I faced great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off. Is that what the president said?
Well, I don't remember exactly what the president said, and the notes that they apparently have, I do not think are a direct transcript. But the gist of the conversation was that the president feels as if he's hamstrung in his ability to work with Russia to find areas of cooperation, because this has been obviously so much in the news. And that was the intention of that portion of the conversation.
Did you know he was going to report that to the Russians, and what did you think when you heard it?
Report what, George?
What he said about James Comey, that he'd fired him, and why?
Well, the firing had been in the news, but I didn't know in advance that the president was going to raise it. But as I mentioned, he raised it in the context of explaining that feels as if he's been unable to find areas of cooperation with Russia, even as he confronts them in key areas where they're being disruptive, like Syria, for example, and the subversive activities across Europe, their support for not only the Assad regime, but for Iran and its activities across the Middle East.
Did you understand how this might look, though, to an average American right now? You have the President of the United States telling the Russian foreign minister in their first meeting that the pressure is off because he's fired the FBI director investigating Russian interference in the campaign. Does that seem appropriate to you?
As you know, it's very difficult to take a few lines, to take a paragraph out of what appear to be notes of that meeting, and to be able to see the full context of the conversation. As I mentioned last week, the really purpose of the conversation was to confront Russia on areas, as I mentioned, like Ukraine and Syria, their support for Assad and their support for the Iranians, while trying to find areas of cooperation as an area of counterterrorism and the campaign against ISIS. And so that was the intent of that conversation, was to say, what I'd like to do is move beyond all of the Russia news so that we can find areas of cooperation.
So did the president confront them on their interference in our election? This was their first meeting.
Well, you know, there already was too much that's been leaked from those meetings, and one of the things that I'm most concerned about is the confidence, the confidentiality of those kind of meetings, as you know, are extremely important. And so I'm really concerned about these kind of leaks, because it undermines everybody's trust in that kind of an environment where you can have frank, candid, and oftentimes, you know, unconventional conversations to try to protect American interests and secure the American people.
I understand your concern about leaks, but I could also see the feeling of perhaps someone likely on your staff or in your community who leaked this, thinking that they had a duty to leak it, because you have this apparent contradiction, the president disparaging the person who is investigating the Russians but not confronting the Russians who interfered in our election.
Well, as you know, the initial leak that came out was a leak about concerns about revealing intelligence sources and methods, information that's not even part of the president's briefing. And so in a concern about divulging intelligence, they leaked actually not just the information from the meeting, but also indicated the sources and methods to a newspaper. I mean, it doesn't make sense, George.
I take your point on that, although there's also the question of whether or not it was right for the president to give that information to the Russians. But I just asked a direct question. Did the president confront the Russians on their interference in our election?
Well, I'm not going to divulge more of that meeting. Those meetings, as you know, are supposed to be privileged. They're supposed to be confidential. They're supposed to allow the president and other leaders to have frank exchanges.
Well, let me ask just one final question then on that meeting, because Sean Spicer has spoken out about it, the president's press secretary. He said, by grandstanding and politicizing the investigation into Russia's action, James Comey created unnecessary pressure on our ability to engage and negotiate with Russia. You're the president's national security advisor. Do you agree that the former FBI director's grandstanding and politicizing, those are Sean Spicer's words, hurt our ability to deal with Russia?
I think what's been hurting our ability to deal with Russia more than any other factor has been Russia's behavior. But since President Trump has taken action in Syria, we think that there may be opportunities to find areas of cooperation in places like Ukraine, in places like Syria in particular.
After your first press conference on that meeting, your friend and former colleague, retired Colonel John Nagel, told NPR that you're in an impossible situation because the president expects you to defend the indefensible. What's your reaction to that?
I don't think I'm in an impossible situation. I think what the president expects and what is my duty to do as national security advisor and as an officer in our Army is to give my best advice, to give my best candid advice. You know, nobody elected me to make policy. What my job is to give the president options to integrate the efforts across all of our agencies and departments. And then once the president makes decisions, to help him execute those decisions to protect and advance the interests of the American people. So I find no difficulty at all serving our nation and serving the president in my current capacity.
But if the president did put you in that position, as you wrote about with President Johnson and Vietnam, would you resign? Would you push back?
Well, you know, there was some middle ground there during the Vietnam period. What occurred in that period is many of the president's senior advisors, civilian and military, didn't give their best advice because they concluded that what would be appropriate for them to do, given what Johnson expected, President Johnson expected, was to tell him the advice he wanted to hear. I don't think the president expects that from me. And certainly I don't think I'd be fulfilling my duties and responsibilities unless I gave him not just my candid advice, that's really not my job either. It's to integrate and coordinate across the departments and agencies to give him the best advice from across our government and with our key multinational partners.
But it sounds like one of the difficulties of this meeting, and I do want to get onto the trip, is that when the president disparaged James Comey, when he gave that information to the Russians who had interfered in our campaign, when he apparently did not confront the Russians over this, he didn't even ask your advice.
Well, George, what I'd like to talk about is where I am right now in Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think I answered the questions concerning the meeting. I'd like to move on while we still have time.
We definitely will have time. So did the president ask you your advice about this before he talked about James Comey?
The president always asks our advice before these sorts of sessions, but the subject of the FBI investigation, to my recollection, didn't come up. But really, that conversation, although I don't want to talk about any more of the specifics from within it, covered a broad range of subjects, most of which had to do with areas in which we think Russia's behavior has been unacceptable and is increasing risk to international security, is supporting those who are helping to create a humanitarian crisis in Syria and across the region. That would be the Assad regime and Iran. But then also look for areas where we could cooperate and begin to move toward a resolution of conflicts in Ukraine, in Syria, and then to be able to cooperate more effectively in our counterterrorism campaigns.
Let's talk broadly about the goal of this trip. The president said you've had a very good start. What exactly do you want to accomplish?
Well, really three main things. The first is to advance the security of the American people and to recognize that to do that, America needs allies and partners to deal with the very complex problems that we're dealing with. And of course, in this region, those are two main and interconnected problems. The problem of transnational terrorist organizations, some of which now, like ISIS, control territory and populations and resources. But then how that problem is connected more broadly to the problem of Islamist extremism and the brainwashing of youth with really an irreligious ideology that is meant to foment hatred and justify violence against innocents. And then the second problem of Iran and Iran's actions across the region, which we believe are aimed at keeping the Arab world perpetually weak and mired in a very destructive civil war. And you see that in Syria, obviously, at great human cost, but you see it in Yemen as well. You see it to a certain extent in Iraq. And so security, cooperation, counterterrorism, but also counter-extremism is a big part of it.
As you know, the Saudis...
The second part of it...
Go ahead.
No, the second part of it is economic cooperation, being able to get better access to markets, develop trade relationships, to create American jobs. There were a lot of really important signings that happened in that connection. And the third is to foster, this is just for this leg of the trip, better defense cooperation in the region and to encourage additional burden sharing, responsibility sharing with allies and partners so Americans don't foot the full bill for security in this region and globally as well.
The Saudis have been, in the past, consistent backers of extremists around the world, around the region, and around the world. Are you convinced that they're truly ready to change?
Well, we're going to ask them to convince us. And so there's some very good first steps being taken with the establishment of a Center for Combating Global Extremism or Terrorist Extremism. We'll have to see what the results are. But I think the willingness to talk about it is somewhat different than it has been in the past. And as you know, the record is poor, going back to the 60s and 70s and beyond, and even today. And so what we need to convene leaders across all religions, and this is a big theme of this trip, is to promote tolerance and cooperation across all religions to identify these terrorists for who they are, the enemies of all civilized people, irreligious criminals who use a perverted interpretation of religion to advance their criminal and political agendas. And that's the tone and tenor of the conversations that occurred today, which I think is encouraging. Now, there have to be concrete steps taken. Funding has to be cut off to these madrasas and mosques that are fomenting hatred and intolerance. Funding has to be cut off to terrorist organizations through effective threat finance measures, and that's a big part of the initiative as well. And so we'll see. I mean, I think the expectation is that we deliver results together. That's what we've said that we expect of each other, and that'll be a big part of the conversation tomorrow when the group of leaders expands dramatically to include not only the Gulf Cooperation Council, but also about 50 nations of predominantly Muslim and Islamic populations.
General McMaster, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, George.
Let's bring in Republican Senator Ben Sasse. He's just out with a new book called The Vanishing American Adult, Our Coming-of-Age Crisis, How to Build a Culture of Self-Reliance. Senator, thank you for joining us. Going to get to the book in a moment. First, though, the news of the week. You just heard General McMaster right there and his reaction to that meeting with the Russians, where the president was apparently freelancing when he talked about James Comey and said the pressure was off after he fired them. Was it appropriate for the president to be talking to the Russians about that?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. Obviously, we don't have aligned interests with Russia. Russia is, Putin in particular, is an enemy of free speech, religion, press, assembly. He's the enemy of many of the things that are at the beating heart of America. So we need to be clear that we don't have aligned interests with Russia. And yet, there's a lot in that last segment that's pretty encouraging for the American people, I think. General McMaster is a special guy. The president should be applauded for having him in place. And I think he said clearly in that interview, I heard most of your segment, he said the biggest problem between U.S. and Russian relations is Russian behavior. That's a pretty good thing to have the administration acknowledging.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. But if you listen to the whole interview, it also sounded like the president didn't even confront Russia on the election interference. This was his first meeting with a high-level Russian official. The president disparaged the person investigating Russia, didn't apparently confront them on their own interference.
Yeah, no, clearly we need to know a lot more about what happened in 2016. Russia has bad motives toward the U.S., past, present, and future. We need to know more about 2016, and the American people should applaud the appointment of Bob Mueller this week as special counsel. I also think we need to be looking to the future, because what comes next in 2018 and 2020 is more aggressive Russian behavior, augmented by new kinds of technology that are going to make the erosion of American public trust even easier for Russia to advance. So obviously we, the American people, all across the political spectrum and in both the legislative and the executive branches, need to be confronting the challenge that we face from Russia going forward, as well as see the investigation play out about last cycle.
You're a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's been a remarkable 10 days of news coming out of the White House ever since the president fired James Comey. We've learned reports that the president asked Comey for a loyalty pledge back in January, that in February he told Comey he hopes that he'll close the Flynn investigation, the firing of Comey, saying that Russia was on his mind, and then he tells the Russians the pressure is off the next day. When you put that all together, when you see that pattern, what does it tell you?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot that's troubling about that. There's also a lot that we don't know yet, and I want to underscore how good it is for America that Bob Mueller has this position. This is a decorated Marine through to U.S. Attorney to head of the criminal division to, you know, bipartisan applauded head of the FBI for 12 years. Lots of good stuff for the American people to put hope in about the fact that Bob Mueller is going to conduct that investigation. But frankly, we all need to be looking forward to the task of trying to rebuild trust in a lot of these institutions. The FBI doesn't take loyalty pledges to an individual. The FBI is a special institution that is supposed to be defending the American Constitution by letting investigative paths go where they lead. And obviously, when you're an agent at the Bureau all the way up to the director of the Bureau, you don't take a loyalty pledge. That's a specific agency that has a really hard job, and we need the American people to know that they can trust the FBI in the future. And so everybody needs to be taking it upon themselves to say, what am I doing now to advance the ability of the American people to trust in institutions of our government like the Bureau in the future?
Well, that's one of the big questions. Do you think the president is doing that? You know, you're a Republican, but you made no secret during the campaign of your opposition to candidate Trump, and you said he displayed no understanding at the time of our constitutional system. Are the fears you expressed in the campaign playing out now?
Listen, the problems that we face in terms of not having a shared understanding of why America has limited government and what the constitutional structure of checks and balances are supposed to protect, that problem isn't a problem just in the last 4 months. It isn't a problem just in the last 18 months. We've had an erosion of an understanding of basic American civics for decades. But yeah, I am concerned that at this particular moment, there's not enough long-term thinking about how we restore an understanding of the American American structure of government. So I wish that everybody in government, including in particular the president, would spend a lot more time and energy saying 5 and 10 years from now, am I going to have contributed to a world where American kids understand why the First Amendment is so glorious? Because right now there's a ton of data. Our kids don't understand it, and we're not teaching them. And that starts all across the federal government. And no one's doing enough to restore that.
And that's one of the things you write about in your new book, The Vanishing American Adult. You know, first of all, as I looked at it, it made me think I have to do a better job of toughening up my kids. But you also made a separate point. You argue that better parenting, building a more resilient generation, is essential to the success of our democracy. Explain what you mean by that.
Listen, far too many of our kids that are stuck in a state of perpetual adolescence right now. And that's more our fault than theirs. We're not doing enough to celebrate scar tissue together. Our kids have huge potential, but they are also going to have a demand and a necessity of becoming more resilient than the generations before them, because they're entering an economy where at age 40 and 45 and 50 and 55, they're likely going to get disintermediated not only out of their firm, but out of their entire industry. That's never happened before in human history. We're going to have to build a civilization of lifelong learners. And at the same time as we should be toughening our kids, we're trying to bubble as our kids come of age, that right now we're not spending enough time attentive to habit formation for our kids. And again, this book is a constructive book. It's do about it to do kids. Blame-laying book, blame to be laid. It's on we that are not attentive enough to what kind of formative experiences will help our kids.
I got to show everybody a tweet you sent. It was a picture of you and Senator Schumer. Apparently, you were just coming out of the gym. Schumer and I are smoking reefer outside a wedding. Little joke. Right. You want to use it to get to a serious point, because one of the other things you've been talking about, you've compared Washington right now to a kiddie soccer game, no cooperation across party lines. Leader Senator Schumer, some of your Republican colleagues are saying now is the time to abandon this partisan effort on health care and work on bipartisan proposals right now.
Well, first, when I say things like kiddie soccer, what I mean is there's a whole and almost. So fundamentally, the American people don't really know priorities in Washington. I'm the third or fourth most conservative guy in the Senate by vote. I'm not making an mushy middle. I'm making. How do we prioritize what core issues we should be focused on for 5 and 10 and 15 years from now? Because this city is obsessed with short-termism. So that's really what I mean by kiddie soccer. But on health care, I think it's pretty clear that the 5 and 10 and 15-year agenda for America should be that we create a health care system where the American people can buy the policy that they want and take it with them across job and geographic change. Right now, I think Obamacare exacerbates more problems than it solves. I think it needs to be fully repealed and replaced. But we Republicans also need to admit that the American healthcare system wasn't doing what it needed to do pre-Obamacare. So the problems didn't originate with Obamacare. They're much deeper than that. And as we transition to a more mobile, portable economy, we need the American people to know they're going to be able to buy a policy that goes with them across job and geographic change. Right now, on the side, Obamacare, the challenge before us is longer term than that.
Senator Sasse, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for being in Nebraska, George.
Our roundtable coming up, and up next, two top House leaders on how they're going to investigate President Trump. Chaffetz and Elijah Cummings join us live.
This week with George.
Just because there's an investigation or work being done at the Department of Justice doesn't excuse the Congress from doing its own work and getting to the bottom of things.
This is about the fight for the soul of our democracy. We cannot afford to lose this one.
There you see the leaders of the House Oversight Government Reform Committee, Chairman Jason Chaffetz, Ranking Democrat Elijah Cummings. They both join us now this morning. Congressman, thank you for joining us this morning. Mr. Chairman, let me begin with you. And first of all, your reaction to the more we're learning about that extraordinary meeting between the president and the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. You have both the revelation of highly classified information and then this report in the New York Times that the president was talking about James Comey in the meeting, calling him a nut job and saying the pressure is off. Your reaction?
Well, I hope that's not true. I don't know if that was said or not said. I would think the president to kind of beat him over the head with the fact that if they did, the Russians, if they actually did interfere in any way, shape, or form, how wrong that is and how outraged America is on both sides of the aisle.
Congressman Cummings, it sounds like, if you were listening carefully to General McMaster, that the president apparently didn't even confront the Russians with their interference there. Will you all demand to see the notes of that meeting?
We've been asking for, I want every note that they have, George. There have been so many lies, so many contradictions, and I think documents will help us to ferret out exactly what's the truth and what's a lie. And so I'm hoping that the chairman will issue subpoenas so that we can get every document, because I think that's what we need.
And Mr. Chairman, you've also asked on a different matter, you've also asked the Justice Department and James Comey for any documents he has of any meetings with the president publicly testify next Wednesday, May 24th, given that deadline. Have you heard from James Comey? Have you heard from the Justice Department?
What I have heard is that I believe Director Comey and I are going to have a conversation on Monday, and so I have not spoken directly with him. It's important to remember nobody's actually seen these documents. Even the reporter at the New York Times has not seen these documents. So there's been an awful lot written and said about it, but I don't even know that the Department of Justice has them. Maybe Director Comey has them. I don't know where they reside. I don't know if they are documents. But we're certainly pursuing them, and if they're there, I hope we find them and get them sooner rather than later.
And Congressman Cummings, when you look at the pattern of the president's interactions with the former FBI director, as I was asking Senator Sasse earlier, the meetings in January, the meeting in February, the firing of James Comey, what we've learned about the notes of James Comey, some of your Democratic colleagues are already seeing there the beginnings of a case for impeachment. Are they right, or is that going too far?
I think that we need to gather the facts. I've been always one to be very careful with regard to the gathering of the facts and then coming to the conclusions, as opposed to having a conclusion and trying to search for the facts. I've seen that in the past so many times. I think that that'll take care of itself. But basically, George, there are three things going on here. One, we've got to figure out what this whole idea of the Russians interfering with our elections was all about. After all, 17 of our intelligence agencies said it did happen. Two, we've got to figure out whether there was collusion, and that I'm sure that'll come out. And three, we've got to figure out exactly whether there was some type of cover-up. That's how I see this. And so all along, we're going to have to look at it very carefully. But again, the Congress has its role. We have a role for an independent commission and certainly the special counsel. One
of the other things we learned, Mr. Chairman, this week is that, according to the Washington Post, there is a person of interest in the investigation who is now a senior official in the White House. Does the White House have an obligation to reveal who that individual is and wall that individual off from any sensitive information?
Well, I want to see that this person is prosecuted. I think the president makes a very good point. No matter who's in the White House, you cannot have the type of leaking of information, sources, methods, classified information. I don't care who it is, Democrat or Republican, you cannot have that happen. So not only do you need to wall them off, you probably ought to put some handcuffs on them and put them in jail.
Well, that's for people who are leaking. That's different from the person of interest in this investigation, isn't it?
Well, I don't know where this is going to go. I mean, again, we got to step back and let the investigators and the FBI and the others do their job. We are not in a position to actually dive in and go individual by individual and do these types of interviews. We got to let those professionals in the Department of Justice do that.
Congressman Cummings, how do you think the White House should deal with that person of interest in the investigation?
Well, I think that all of that's going to come out whether the White House acts or not. I think that will be left up to Mr. Mueller, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. And there will be, hopefully, parallel investigations going on. Just the other day in our briefing, Mr. Rosenstein basically told us that he pretty much welcomed us pursuing our investigation with regard to looking at this broad picture of the whole idea of the Russians interfering with our elections.
On that point,
And
can I
he
just
made it
interrupt you for a second there, Congressman? Because
Sure,
in that meeting,
sure.
is it true that Mr. Rosenstein did not tell you who told him to write that memo that was released at parallel with the firing of James Comey?
No, he didn't. He did not tell us. No, he did not. But again, we've got to understand that you got to ask him. But I can tell you, George, as my impression when I walked out of the briefing was that this thing runs deep. In other words, I think that there may be quite a few people that may have some problems with the law with regard to this whole incident. But we've got to stay focused. Impeachment is one thing, but George, we got to concentrate on the fact that the Russians interfered with our elections. And I keep telling people, don't get so caught up in impeachment that you forget about that, because I'm telling you, that's something that goes to the very heart of our democracy. And we can't have people in Russia determining who will be the president of the United States and what policies will be pursued. No, we cannot have that. And Democrats and independents, all of us, ought to be concerned about that. And that's a role that clearly the Congress has to play, and that's a role that an independent commission that Congressman Schwarwell and I have proposed would play.
Mr. Chairman,
finding those answers to those questions.
Mr. Chairman, final question. You've announced you're going to be leaving Congress on June 30th. Some of your colleagues are suggesting that you should leave now so the next chairman should get to work. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, look, I'll work with the steering committee, and we'll pass the baton. That's why I announced when I did. I gave people 6 weeks notice. I was honest and candid about it, and I just want to simply pass the baton, and we will do so, because there's a lot of investigations going on, a lot of good work, and I want to do it in the right way.
Congressman Chaffetz, Congressman Cummings, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Roundtable's coming up with analysis of an extraordinary week, plus live in Saudi Arabia with the president.
This week with George Stephanopoulos, brought to you by Optum.
We're on to you, diabetes. Time's up insufficient prenatal care. And administrative paperwork, your days of drowning people are numbered. Same goes for you, budget overruns. And rising costs. Wipe that smile off your face. We're coming for you too. For those who won't rest until the world is healthier, neither will we. Optum, how well gets done.
Hi, I'm Frank. I take Movantik for OIC, opioid-induced constipation. Had a bad back injury. My doctor prescribed opioids, which helped with the chronic pain, but backed me up. Big time. Tried prunes, laxatives, still constipated. Had to talk to my doctor. She said, "How long you been holding this in?" That was my Movantik moment. My doctor told me that Movantik is specifically designed for OIC and can help you go more often. Don't take Movantik if you have a bowel blockage or a history of them. Movantik may cause serious side effects, including symptoms of opioid withdrawal, severe stomach pain and/or diarrhea, and tears in the stomach or intestine. Tell your doctor about any side effects and about medicines you take. Movantik may interact with them, causing side effects. Why hold it in? Have your Movantik moment. Talk to your doctor about opioid-induced constipation. If you can't afford your medication, AstraZeneca may be able to help.
What we do every night is like something out of a strange dream. Except that the next morning, it all makes sense. FedEx powers global e-commerce with networks built over 40 years. that are massive, far-reaching, and yes, maybe a bit magical. Visit FedEx.com/dream.
What if we pull customer insights from the data in real time?
Wait, our data center and our clouds can't connect?
Michael, can we get this data to...
Look at me. Look at me. Look at me. You used to be the yes guy. What happened to that guy?
Legacy technology can handcuff any company, but yes is here.
So you're saying we can cut delivery time?
Yeah. With help from HPE, we can finally work the way we want to.
With the right mix of hybrid IT, everything computes.
Back now with more on the president's trips to Saudi Arabia. Our colleague John Carl is there right now with the president. John, we're waiting the president's speech coming up, described as a major speech to the Muslim world, a message of hope and tolerance. And from the excerpts we've seen, appears to be a pretty dramatic break from his campaign rhetoric.
A strikingly different tone, George, from what we heard from the president during the campaign. He is talking about the war on terror, but not portraying it as a clash of civilization or a war of the West against Islam, but instead as a fight between good and evil, where moderate Muslims around the world are our allies in the fight. In those excerpts, one line that stuck out to me was this: this is not a battle between different faiths, different sects, or different civilizations.
And so far from the excerpts we've seen, no mention of that radical Islamic terrorist, which of course the president said was necessary to talk about during the campaign. The White House also placing great stock in what the king of Saudi Arabia is going to say, him taking on extremists.
Absolutely, saying it is the responsibility of Muslim leaders to take on the terrorists in their midst. And this has been a strikingly warm welcome for the president. You saw the king greet him at the airport. That's a courtesy that was not afforded to President Obama in his most recent visits here to Saudi Arabia. And the president was given at one point a ceremonial sword and took part in a peace dance, a traditional Saudi peace dance, seemed to thoroughly relish the moment, and so did his embattled aides, who some of them took part, all smiles. And, you know, finally, George, there was a moment here with the president of Egypt, where the president of Egypt said that Donald Trump has a unique personality and is capable of accomplishing the impossible. As soon as the translator was done translating it, the president laughed and said, "I agree." So what you see here is really a welcome relief from all the tension back home, but it's more than that. He is going to be surrounded by the leaders of more than 50 Islamic nations around the world. For somebody who, as a candidate, said Islam hates us, this trip is also quite an accomplishment.
Well, you're right. And the president does seem to be getting that break that they needed and they wanted and they expected coming out of this. It's just the beginning of this trip, going on to Israel, going on to the Vatican, going to meet with G8 leaders as well. Quite a long trip for a first trip.
It's an incredibly long trip. You mentioned, you know, from here to Israel to the Vatican. Brussels is where the NATO meeting is. The G7 meeting is in Sicily. All told, 9 days. I'm told that the president's staff kind of didn't really bring up exactly how long it was until shortly before departure, and that when he saw how long it was, he actually asked if it could be made shorter. It will not be made any shorter. At least that's not the plan.
Well, maybe this first welcome will make him want that long trip. Okay, John Carl, thanks very much. We'll be checking in with you later. And we'll be right back with the Powerhouse Roundtable. We have a lot to talk about now on our roundtable. I'm joined by our chief political analyst, Matthew Dowd, Democratic Congressman Keith Ellison, the deputy chair of the DNC, Newsmax Media CEO Christopher Ruddy, a friend of the president's, who's joining us now as an ABC News contributor, and Democratic strategist Stephanie Cutter. And Matthew, let me begin with you. What a dizzying 10 days it has been ever since the president fired James Comey. A headline every single day, usually right around 5 o'clock. Try to put everything in context. Where are we now in this presidency?
Well, a week like no other, coming from a presidency, a first 100 days like no other, coming from an election like no other. I mean, I think we're now in a phase, I mean, it's a bombshell after bombshell. My guess is next Sunday, we're going to sit here and say, wow, can you believe what just happened this week in this? I think we're in a marathon phase now, and I think it's important for everybody to sort of understand that. I know we all focus on the one little bit, but I think right now you have a special counsel, Robert Mueller, who's going to take this wherever he takes it. And I don't think people fully understand. It's not just about the tree of Russia or collusion. He's going to go for all the root systems throughout that, and wherever that goes, he's going to examine. And I also don't think we should underestimate what the House committee and the Senate committee could do or could reveal in the course of this. People forget that during Watergate, and I'm not comparing the two, but during Watergate, that it was not only a special counsel that was involved, but the House committee and the Senate committee did an extensive research on that, and they revealed much of what came out of Watergate was revealed in the House and Senate committees.
Let me pick up on that right there, and I want to bring this to Chris Ruddy, because it does appear that this showdown with James Comey is going to come sooner rather than later. We now know that he's going to speak to the Senate Intelligence Committee sometime, it appears, in June. And he's got notes of every encounter with the president. The president threatened him with tapes. How does the president survive that showdown?
Legal experts I've spoken to, Alan Dershowitz, for instance, say there's no obstruction in this. What the president did was perfectly legal. He had a right to speak to the FBI director about the matter. I think the press is criminalizing this. I think it's a little weird, and I think it's the president's instinct about letting Comey go was right. This memo proves it. Isn't it a little strange that the
What memo proves it?
Well, the leaked memo or the details of the leak, we haven't seen the memo yet, of Director Comey's conversation with the president.
That's reason to fire him?
Well, I think it's about his instinct that you can't trust the FBI director. Isn't it a little strange? The FBI director has a private conversation with the president. Instead of saying to the president, Mr. President, you're new to this job, you're not a legal law enforcement guy, what you're saying is inappropriate to me. Speak to your White House counsel and the Justice Department about how to approach this. Instead, he goes back to his office, he writes a memo to himself, sticks it in a file, supposedly did this on every presidential encounter. What was his purpose for writing these memos? If he thought the president was doing something inappropriate, George, he should have immediately spoken to the president about it, then gone to his attorney general.
What I think that the President Trump doesn't understand is that the FBI director is not meant to be loyal to that president. That's the reason that they serve 10-year terms. And it's unusual for a president to ask for a one-on-one meeting with the FBI director. And even the president asked other people to leave the room in those encounters. And it's a very common practice in a situation like that to go back to your office, write down what happened, to ensure that you remember the facts correctly. It's a prosecutorial practice.
Don't you agree that if he saw the president was doing something inappropriate, he should have immediately acted on it?
But is that any reason, though,
and we don't know if the president asked him for loyalty.
Said? Is that
that's a leaked comment.
Well, that was from a different meeting in
January. So many stories, fake news stories, are becoming fact here. Where in the Russian investigation has there ever been an allegation that the president had done anything wrong with the Russians? Where is there any evidence?
But we didn't hold on.
Before we have this major investigation underway, there's no evidence of collusion.
And it's his Justice Department that appointed a special counsel because they see the problem.
George, what I want to say is that, you know, I've just been on the trail talking to people all over the country. I was just in Oklahoma. And to them, it's like, yeah, this Russia thing, they're very concerned about it, but also the healthcare debate we're in, repealing Dodd-Frank, the whole piece of it is what people are really focused on. You want to talk about what's the real story as opposed to this week's mess? All this stuff just looks to people like it's crazy, it's chaotic, and I'm going to show up at my congressman's meeting, and I'm going to be part of this upsurge of democracy.
Regardless, to me, this is all going to unfold, and we're going to learn a lot more, and we already have learned a lot more, which we wouldn't have but for come out. I mean, that's part of this that I think is important to understand. When we look forward on this, Donald Trump has been a victim of his own errors in every step of the way. This is not all of these things have come out. You can blame FBI Director Comey for saying he should have done this. It was created by what Donald Trump did. You can blame him for, like, well, somebody leaked a thing about Mike Flynn. This is somebody that Donald Trump hired. All of these things are unforced errors. They're interceptions, and everybody keeps saying it's like Johnny Manziel, right? It's like Johnny Manziel saying, "Why is everybody talking about me?" Well, because you keep doing it.
And Chris Ruddy, you're seeing the same complaints even from inside the White House now. You know that the bit leaks apparently are the bane of the president's existence. He is complaining to everybody. One of the things we're seeing from inside the White House is they're saying, we don't know how to handle this. The president is the problem.
The Shorenstein Center came out from Harvard, not a conservative organization, this week, study of the press coverage of the Trump administration to date. They said 80% negative coverage. Look at the language in their report. Never had there been anything like this in modern American presidents.
He's not
Matthew,
a victim.
Stephanie have been involved in
He's
other...
not a victim.
And
That's because they're covering the news.
But what about, look, a week ago, the Chinese opened their markets to U.S. businesses. Presidents have been trying for 30 years to do this. Donald Trump did it in just over 3 months.
He also got some trademarks that came back at a suspicious time. I mean, this is whole monetization of the presidency problem. So when you talk about him opening up...
Do you think, you know, you represent people in Michigan. Do you think Minnesota, I'm sorry. But it's, again, a very Midwestern state. True. Don't you think that people there are seeing that jobs are important? The president's made this a priority. You wouldn't know that watching the press.
Well, look, we're looking at his budget coming out. We already saw the skinny budget. He's about to decimate people who voted for him. He's going to cut the Appalachian Regional Council. These folks voted for this guy. And when you know, on this trip he's on, I mean, I'm shocked. He said, Saudi Arabia and I get along great with all of them. They buy apartments for me. They spend 40 million, 50 million, and I'm supposed to dislike them. So now he's in Saudi Arabia, and we're supposed to celebrate that. It goes back to him just trying to cash in on being the president of the United States. And not focusing on
he's just brought tens of thousands of jobs with that arms deal.
Those studies, which is great. I think that's very factual and all this. All they're doing is reporting on what actually is going on. And if that happens to be 80 or 90% negative...
The press is driving the narrative here.
No, Donald Trump is driving it.
It's Donald Trump's missteps.
Anything good that Donald Trump...
He steps on.
Well, no, you guys just don't want to report on it. I think there's a balance. I think criticizing the president is fine. Some of the things he's done are not right. He needs to, and he will be on a learning curve. This is a guy who's never been a politician.
I just
if you
never
look
thought
at the polling data, and Matthew's an expert on this, you know that the president still has the same voters that voted for him say they will. Let
me do a thought experiment with you for a second. You talked about how 10 days ago we should have been reporting more about the opening up of the Chinese beef markets markets to American
more
beef.
than that.
At that exact same time, the president fired the FBI director. His entire staff came out for 24 hours, including the vice president, giving one reason for the firing. 24 hours later, the president gave us a completely separate reason for the firing, saying he had Russia on his mind. How are we supposed to ignore that?
They need to synchronize their messaging in the White House. It's a new presidency. There's a lot of problems. This is not the first time that presidential administrations have had messaging problems.
This is not a message problem.
Look, you forget, why didn't the press report on all the Democrats that called for Comey's resignation a few months prior? That was not part of the narrative. Let's remember.
George, that is a red herring. The fact is,
Chuck Schumer said he should be fired.
We are raising this problem with Comey's firing because Comey was investigating him. This is not about like Comey, don't like Comey. This is about the guy who's investigating you for colluding with a foreign hostile power to undermine our elections. You fire the guy, and then you say, oh, well, we don't have to worry about him. To the country that is undermining your elections, this is outrageous. You got to focus on why we are raising these issues.
Right.
It's about what he did and the firing.
And working in the White House on a normal day is on a 1 to 10 scale, it's a 10 in terms of tension. Under this current White House, I can't imagine what those staffers are going through. It's not a synchronization of message, it's a synchronization of truth. The president completely did a 180 on them.
Well, I talked to people at the White House, and they're saying they're very frustrated by the negative press coverage, and no president.
They're frustrated that they don't know when the president's
Can we all agree that no president in modern history has undergone the barrage of negative press attacks?
I'll make an argument. The last person to talk about a witch hunt, the last person to say the press was the enemy, and the last person that said all the leakers should be locked up, you know who that was? Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is the last person to do the same message, the same thing that happened. And when we look at this, the leakers actually helped. Mark Felt helped bring down a president who was a corrupt person in office that did many things. So let's not talk about the press. The only thing the press is doing, they have their faults. They have that. They're reporting facts on what this president says and does, and what his White House says and does. I'm going to say one thing about the Democrats. I think the Democrats have to be very careful in this process. They can't get ahead of their skis. The American public wants this to unfold. They're very concerned. If you talk to the American public, they're very concerned about what Donald Trump is doing. But if the Democrats get too far ahead of their skis, then the American public is going to back up. They want the facts to lead where it should.
You even saw Congressman Cummings there, Stephanie Cutter, push back against that talk of impeachment coming from some of his colleagues. He can't seem to be gunning for this.
No, you can't. I mean, look, is this mired in politics? Absolutely. However, we can't make this investigation a political process. And I think that the Senate Intelligence Committee is actually handling it in a very bipartisan way. We do have to let the facts determine where we go here. There is a special counsel investigation out of the Department of Justice, and there are multiple congressional investigations. Let's see what we learn from them. We're going to learn something.
I'm afraid that is going to have to be the last word. We're out of time for today. Much more to talk about in coming weeks. We'll be right back.
Thanks, George.